And the key thing about Peter is that he is clearly the leader of that apostolic group. Because in the apostolic lists, in Matthew, Mark and Luke, the 12 are given, there's two constants, because all the names are jumbled up, except Peter is the first, and Judas Iscariot is the last. And then in St. Matthew's Gospel, you've got the statements that Jesus makes to Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I shall give thee the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Not to the other apostles, just to him. Because later on in chapter 18, two chapters later, Jesus gives the power to bind and loose to all the apostles. And we Catholics say what that means is then Peter is the head, he has unique authority himself on his own, but all of them together with him have this supernatural power to bind and loose, which is really a reference to supernatural authority on earth, which takes effect in heaven too. That's why I'm a Catholic. Short version, as I can make it.
Brilliant. I was just going to say...
Yeah, because he's been quiet, so let him follow.
Sorry. I was just going to say, you mentioned about Peter being sort of like the chief apostle.
Yes.
Reading the epistles in the New Testament, there is a sort of sense that St. Paul also had the authority of an apostle. Yeah. I think he called himself as such.
Yes.
So, I mean, there is that sort of dichotomy between Peter and Paul to a certain extent.
Yes, you're absolutely right. In fact, in Galatians, Peter has an argument with Paul, and he told him off, because he felt Peter was doing the wrong thing by withdrawing from eating with Gentiles when some Jews came from Jerusalem. Now, without saying whether Paul was entirely right on that, because you see, what people don't seem to say is, look, Peter was the head. A head has to have a certain degree of diplomacy. You might want to not rub a person's nose in it. As Paul was happy to rub people's nose in it, he had the truth, and so he's going to tell you the truth, like it or lump it. I think that's the Pauline phrase that isn't in the Bible, like it or lump it. But Peter being the boss, in my view, would actually be a bit more nuanced and careful. Yes, he'd agree with Paul, but Paul is clearly a bit hot-headed. Doesn't mean Paul's wrong, just a bit imprudent possibly. Even so, this is a brilliant moment for Protestants to meditate on, I think, because in the early church, though Jesus has appointed Peter with this special authority, doesn't mean you're not going to get somebody like Paul or somebody else come along and say, oh yeah, right, you're the boss, but I think this, I'll do that, leave me alone. It's like the apostolic group is still people, and they can still argue and dispute. And also, there's this idea of being, if you're a leader, like all the apostles were, they've got to be a servant. They're washing that's why Jesus washed their feet. They can't just be bossing people about. So Peter wouldn't boss people about. His successors wouldn't be bossy boots either. Now, we've had popes who've been real bossy boots. I mean, Julius II, he went to hit Michelangelo on the head because Michelangelo wouldn't do something for him in terms of the Sistine Chapel. This is getting a bit out of order.
Hence Protestantism.
Well, I mean, could be. Michelangelo could have triggered it. It was around that time. I think just after, actually. I think Pope Julius was a bit after the Reformation. Nonetheless, we see here the papal authority should not be exercised in a way that's condescending or superior, but it will be exercised that way because people are people. Sometimes it's appropriate, though, for a pope to be extremely firm to deal with heresy. I'm not doubting that. It's just some of these other ways that would seem unbiblical legitimately, but that's because we're all sinners. We must not let that obscure the reality of that authority the head of the apostles has, which Peter was installed in an office. He was given the keys. If you look to Isaiah 22:22, the giving of the keys to the chief minister of King David's kingdom mirrors what Jesus did with Peter. It's fascinating. Jesus is clearly illustrating he's establishing the new Israel, and he's the new David, and he's giving Peter the keys as the new chief steward of that new Davidic kingdom, of which he's master. And so if you belong to the church, which is led by these 12 men, mirroring the 12 patriarchs who became the founders of ancient Israel, you are actually in the church which is New Israel. And if I'm right, and that's the Catholic Church because of the continuity down 2,000 years, then the Catholic Church is the New Israel to which we must all belong.